For Singapore, climate change is a matter of life and death. Not my words, but the words of the Prime Minister. A 4 or 5 meter increase in sea levels would mean that 30% of the country will be flooded. It's also about rising temperatures. I mean, Singapore experienced its hottest day in about 40 years just recently. So it's not surprising that climate has become a national priority. The government has pledged more than $70 billion over the next century to, I guess, guard against damages from climate. Let's get insights perspective from Minister Fu. Good to have you with us.
Thank you very much, Haslinda.
Is the rising sea levels an existential threat to Singapore? Might this little red dot, one of the richest in the world, risk disappearing from the face of the earth?
Absolutely. I think, first of all, we're talking about sea level rise that can actually inundate the country. We are also dealing with more intense rain. We have seen how we have, in July and August, which is supposedly drier months, we're getting rain when we're not expecting. Very intense, very short, but intensity that really can cause problem for us. And we are also looking at the knock-on effects of climate change. We're talking about warmer oceans affecting livestock in the sea. We're talking about changes in temperature and humidity in our forests that could cause or that could allow wildfires, forest fires to go uncontrolled. We have seen that in Canada as well. We're also looking at its impact on the water system. Months with drier conditions, that has an impact on availability of water, has an impact on renewable energy, as we have seen in the case of France last year, where the lack of water or water that's too warm is affecting the generation of nuclear power. The water that they need to cool the plants, for example, wasn't there, wasn't enough. So water itself knocks on to other systems. And we're talking about the most important one, really, is food security. We have seen how variation in weather patterns are causing yield to be affected. India, for example, have just announced that they will have a ban on export of certain rice varieties. And why is that so? It's because they have some bad flooding in the recent months. They expect that to have an impact on the yield, and therefore prices is going to go quite crazy, and therefore they said that for political price stability, they will have to keep the rice for themselves. And of course, for India, such a large rice producer, to do that, you can imagine that many countries around the world will have to deal with the downstream effects of a shortage in food, and that will be food inflation again. So this is now, when it's 1.1 degrees higher in temperature. What if it's going to go to 1.5, 1.8, or 2.3 if some prediction is showing us? So many of these effects is going to be self-reinforcing. We talked about how, for example, dryness in the rainforest is going to cause more fire, and fire will then create or destroy some of our carbon sinks, and that actually causes a vicious cycle. So to us, we take this very seriously across many fronts. We are going ahead with our coastal protection. We have about 135 million in terms of R&D that's set aside for coastal protection work. We've divided the country into 8 parts, starting with sort of detailed forecasting of impact of climate change on each of these sectors. We are calling for proposal. We have some engineering studies done to look at what that would entail, what kind of options, engineering solutions are available to us at the right time in a cost-effective way. We're starting public engagement with stakeholders in those areas to get them sensitized to this possibility, to get them to think about options, to think about new spaces that can be created as a result of this project. That's on coastal protection. We're looking at water security. We have looked at water security for 5 decades. So that's really putting us in a good position. We have desalination plants that has been set up. We have recycling of water that allows us to reuse water endlessly. We are now looking at food security as well. We have the plan to grow 30% of our nutritional needs by 2030, really having the capability to grow in a more climate resilient way, in a more resource resilient way. We invested in R&D to get that going. We put aside some funds to support the capital expenditure of our businesses. We are now working out with our businesses on getting the offtake. They are starting to produce. We are creating space for them to sell their products locally.
So you would say there is a sense of urgency to do something, yet there are skeptics among us. There are people who are still complacent, saying, you know what, you talk about an imminent threat, but that's going to happen in the year 2150, for instance. How do you urge businesses to take action today to protect us in the future?
Well, just look at what's happening around us. If you're looking at in Greece, they have to have warning to move to evacuate their tourists. And if you own a hotel property in one of these Greece islands, what's that going to do to your yield? Going to do with your business, your valuation of your hotel? You're going to ask yourself, is this going to be once in a 50-year event, or is this going to be recurring? Is South Europe going to be a good place for tourists in summer months? So that's really something that businesses should think about. But we are not leaving it just to the business leaders. We are working with, for example, central bankers around the world to start quantifying climatic risk. We need companies to think about the risk of climate on its business. We need bankers to think about the risk of climate to their portfolio. And we also need central bankers around the world to think about how is all that going to add up. If you have a serious flood incident, what's that to do to your portfolio? How's that going to impact your economy? How's that going to impact the wider society? So all levels, businesses, bankers, central bankers, investors, pension fund investments will have to start thinking about this.
Is the private sector on board? Are they buying into this sense of urgency? Because the reports out there suggesting that, yes, the government is clear on what it wants to achieve. Yes, the government has a plan, but the private sector is trailing behind.
Well, of course, like all things, there are companies that are really leading the charge, thinking about this and taking a very offensive position. They see this as a new business. They see that the world is, discovering or looking for new products, alternative energy. So they see this really as a new area of growth. But there are laggards as well. And the laggards will take some time to realize how it's going to impact their businesses. But we think that the momentum is coming. I've seen stronger momentum now this year compared to last. And a lot of it is driven through financial institutions, investors, and of course, from time to time, you will have events that push that back. The Ukraine war, for example, didn't help because you see that, old coal plants started to be turned on again, nuclear plants extended its stay. But I think the trajectory is quite clear, and I think there is a sort of willingness across sectors, particularly among the larger, more progressive companies, to see that movement.
Who are the laggards?
Many companies everywhere.
Which sectors in particular?
Well, many sectors. I think every sector will have its laggards. But as I mentioned, we need to work through the system. For example, our banks in Singapore. I believe that all three major banks, DBS, OCBC, UOB, have pledged 2050 net zero to decarbonize their bank book. They will have to then go sectorally to look at, how do they achieve that net zero targets. There will be sectors that is harder to abate because there's no available commercial technology right now. But having that sort of trajectory, if you know that you are here right now and you're going to go down to zero at that point, 2050, that sort of gives you the kind of time frame, the kind of gradient that you need to work at. And by investing time, resources, including financial resources in R&D, in looking for new projects, I think we're going to find solutions. The amount of investment that has gone in, for example, the US Inflation Reduction Act, for example, has really seen, the growth of, EVs on the car, the growth of investors, academia that's interested to find that solution, the new technology to carbon capture. By having a price tag, if I remember correctly, about $180 per ton for direct air capture, that number is focusing attention of many, many interested parties to look at solutions. Not everyone is going to be cutting edge, right? There will be this that progressive one that's going ahead. But we're also seeing what others, even if you are not really looking for new technology, there are many ways to reduce your carbon footprint. For example, just reducing waste, just reducing, assets that you don't need, or optimizing resource utilization. Have your trucks ply in a more optimized way, reducing number of trips, reducing time that they are going around on the roads. These are all ways that companies, can work very, very, I would say, low-hanging fruits that they can work very easily. As I think one of the speakers said earlier on, not everything needs to be new technology. There are many things that we can do right now to achieve, mitigation.
In terms of private sector participation, what role do you see them playing?
Oh, too many things. When we're looking at, say, just take an example of the agri-tech, the food industry. We need investors that will come in, be really part of this new business that we are developing. We need technology providers that's going to work with us. We need people that's going to invest in infrastructure. We're going to develop a whole piece of agri-tech park in Lim Chu Kang. And in that process, there will be people that's helping us to do planning, design, infrastructure, laying of cables, laying of waste collection facilities, a whole range of possibilities. And more importantly, we are working with companies to offtake. We need the retailers, the supermarket, the caterers to start taking local produce. So there's so many ways that companies, private sectors can participate. And most of all, as I mentioned, we need financiers.
You talk about greening the Singapore economy, yet Singapore is a key hub for refining, petrochemical. It accounts, I think, about 5% of GDP. Is there a plan to pivot away from the industry, to pivot away from its reliance on oil?
Absolutely good question, because we get asked a lot, of our high per capita emission. We have a sizable petrochemical and refinery sector that employs, I think, 26,000 people in Singapore, good paying jobs, and the exports is probably number 8 in terms of refinery capacity. So it's not just for our own domestic consumption. The products are exported to many parts of the world. What do we do in a sector like this? We can take the one way we can say that, we just don't want anything that's brown, that's fossil, and say, get out of Singapore. Where does it go? It has to go somewhere because we are still depending on these sectors to provide us with the chemicals that we need, the plastic that we need, all the PPE or the medical equipments that we are using plastic to make. We need them. So how do we then deal with a second option, which is really work with the industry to decarbonize, to make their products better, and to incentivize them to do so. So
where are you in that journey, in trying to get them to decarbonize?
So we have a carbon tax. We have already implemented it since 2019. We are first in Southeast Asia to do so. Right now it's at $5, 5 Sing dollars per ton. We have already said that it's going to go up to 25 next year. It's going to go up to 45 2 years later, and 50 to 80 by 2030. So that's a very strong signal. It's a signal to companies, large emitters, that to avoid paying the government tax, they should really look at reducing the emission. It's really to make the cost of emission very explicit, and therefore to tilt that level playing field in the favor of green technology. At the same time, we have also said that tax revenue that's collected from carbon tax will actually be put back to the industries, to the companies, to the SMEs, to sort of vulnerable households to help them with the transition, because the transition has to be an inclusive one. So we are really working very closely with the companies that are working on Jurong Island, for example. They have a plan to make Jurong Island a sustainable chemical hub, working with one another, working with regulators, working with logistics players to decarbonize the process. We believe that we have to work with all stakeholders to make this transition.
Minister, you talked about waste. Singapore produces more waste than it can handle. In fact, the Semakau landfill is about to be full. What's the strategy there when that happens? How are you looking at it?
So first of all, we incinerate all our waste. If we're not recycling them, we incinerate them. So by incineration, we are recovering the energy, we are shrinking the volume. So volume that's going down to 2 to 3% its original volume through incineration. And the remaining incineration ash, we put it on Semakau. And that's still filling up quite quickly, as you said. So now we are thinking about, can we recycle the incineration ash as well? We have new sand that can be used for pavements and construction purposes. We are exploring other uses for incineration ash. We are quite hopeful that within a few months, we think, we're going to have some decision on what to do with this incineration ash. And it's not just new ashes that's going to Semakau. We're thinking about mining the entire Semakau to recover the ashes for a second lease of life.
Rising tensions between the US and China. In fact, John Kerry was just in Beijing recently, achieved very little in terms of new commitment from China. Should we just forget about that net zero target? Is it impossible to get there with the two biggest emitters continuing with their tensions?
US and China are two biggest emitters, is two strong superpower, economic powers. We need them to be part of this discussion. We need them to be part of this movement. US has put in place, $370 billion IRA in Inflation Reduction Act. Many, many useful incentives. We see them already at work, already causing interest and movement on the ground. China has a net zero 2060 targets. Impressive plan of rolling out renewable energy, and they are doing that. So I think while there's geopolitical tension, two countries are doing their respective roles to get climate action going. But it's always useful for them to cooperate because we need all parties to come together at the multilateral level. The fact that John Kerry is meeting, the special negotiator, Xie Zhenhua, is a good sign. They're talking. They were not talking before. And we have seen in the past when major countries, big countries get together, when they are able to agree on direction, it gives climate negotiation, a big push. And we hope that this will happen. It happened in G20 in Bali. It happened in G20 the year before. We hope that G20 this year will continue to see that momentum. Is it going to be easy? Not at all. We have seen, sort of past G20 meetings in India, still having problem over Russia-Ukraine, still having problem over a joint communique. But we are hopeful, and we have to keep working at it.
But hope is not a strategy, Minister. Just one final question, because we're running out of time. As we head towards COP28, is it optimistic to even expect anything? And how would you define success at COP28?
I think with COP28, I'm hopeful that we're going to see progress on two fronts. First of all, on the negotiation front, I would like to see that we make, really to do global stocktake. This is something that we've agreed in Paris. It's midway between Paris and 2030, and do a realistic and effective stocktake. In other words, what have we been doing? Where have we been going? Is that enough? If not, what else do we need to do? What can we do? I think there are some, useful thoughts that are being thrown around. Can we look at implementation of renewable energy? Can we look at energy efficiency? as some targets for us to work towards. I also like to see more discussion on adaptation, because I think that's the part that we have not paid sufficient attention. What should we do on water security for the world? What should we do on food security for the world, especially the most vulnerable countries? We need to pay some attention. We need to have a global discussion so that we can reduce and manage the poverty that we are seeing today. And it's going to get worse with climate change.
50–60% chance that it could be a successful meeting?
I hope so. I definitely hope so.
50–60%, that's very low.
I can't put a number to it because it's still ongoing. And the next 6 months is really going to be a lot of work, where a lot of work is done. But I will say that actually COP28, I'm also hopeful to see the non-negotiation track showing concrete results. Because these two has to work hand in hand. Political leaders, environmental ministers like myself, we take the cue from the businesses, we take the cue from our constituents. So when we see that there's actually call for greater policy clarity, for movements in their targets, then I think it gives us the confidence to go in for negotiation. And when we have clearer negotiation outcome, it helps businesses as well. So this itself is a virtuous cycle. It feeds on energy of each other. So we hope that the business sector, finance sector, oil and gas sector, for example, can give us that vibe, that energy, that signal that they want to move and they want clarity of policies from us.
Singapore Environment Minister Grace Fu, we thank you so much for your insights today.
Thank you very much.